at the top, it looks like a Lincoln. It's
Oh
cute.
yeah, sort of like yeah. Hey everybody, it is noon in the east. It is 9 a.m. in the west. I am your host for today, Reed Galen. This is Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, May 23rd, 2022. Want to say thank you so much to Jeff Timmer for sitting in this chair for so many weeks, and glad to be back with all of you. Today, I am flattered and humbled to have my old friend back with me. On air, Elise Jordan. Elise is a native of Mississippi, like our own Stuart Stevens, was a member of the National Security Council starting in 2008 as both a communications director and a presidential speechwriter, and is now a journalist and political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. So, Elise, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to get, in a few minutes, I want to talk about this article that Tim Alberta wrote for The Atlantic about someone who grew up in the evangelical church, and he toured places in Michigan and Tennessee. And I know you have some experience having grown up down in the South, and also the revelations coming out of the Southern Baptist Convention. But before that, you and our very own Trygve Olsen, who is a senior advisor to us and has been at least someone who I have looked to over these many years about how the game we're in is different than the game we're used to. But y'all were down in Georgia in the past, I'd say, week or so doing focus groups down there. So first I want to get your sense of, given that the primary is tomorrow, looks like Brian Kemp is going to resoundingly beat David Perdue in the governor's race, which I think is a good thing. Herschel Walker is basically running unopposed for the Republican Senate seat there. So what was, give us a few takeaways for what y'all learned while you were down there.
It was surprising. Trump looms over everything with Republican voters, but he really is more like this elephant in the room. You didn't hear when we had our Republicans in their focus group, you didn't hear him constantly being mentioned, but he was still a presence. And I think my big takeaway, and I guess this should have been obvious, but it solidified for me and really just gelled. That's what I love about focus groups is sometimes you can like talk with other operatives about ideas and you're talking with people in politics, but until you hear it from the voters, it doesn't all come together sometimes. It's just that Donald Trump might not be on top of the heap as the leader these days, but he dominates the party policy. It's a MAGA party now. MAGA is now mainstream. And it seems kind of obvious, but these Republicans that we had in the groups, we specifically chose Republicans who were not what you would call InfoWars Republicans. They are, got their news from more reputable sources. And it just shows kind of the complete takeover of politics that now, MAGA is completely entrenched in the brand.
So, I think about Republican voters in Georgia. There are the Republicans from places like Dalton, where Marjorie Taylor Greene represents. And then there are Republicans who I would assume, I'm not a Republican anymore, at least I can't speak for you, that would have been more like what we would have considered ourselves, right? Some Buckhead.
The Buckhead. I was about to say exactly, a Buckhead Republican.
So are they in the thrall too, or are they sort of like, they accept that Trump is like runs the party, they're not sure about it? Are they still going to go R when the time comes?
That was fascinating to me. We did a show of hands. Who do you support? What about Ron DeSantis? Was the first name we threw out, and they all are very excited about Ron DeSantis in this particular group. But then we asked, would you vote for Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis in the Republican primary? And they say, their allegiance comes home, and they say they still would vote for Donald Trump and that DeSantis would be a good VP pick for him. And that's, and so they qualify it with that. But he's still, he still is the elephant in the room for sure.
Right. Well, and just as a minor constitutional note for our viewers out there, it is a weird quirk of our presidential election system that the president and vice president cannot come from the same state. So if Ron DeSantis wants to be Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee, he'll have to move across the border to South Georgia, I guess. So what else did you learn from when you let me ask you this: if you asked any culture war questions or the cultural type questions, did you find that cultural issues were dominating amongst these Republicans, or were economic issues dominating, or was it a mix of both?
Well, if we're going to talk about what was cross-cutting and both groups cared about, the Democrats and the Republicans both are very concerned about the economy and the inflation that they're experiencing and how it affects their day-to-day life.
Right.
So not a culture issue, but that was something that they were really concerned with. And I guess if there is a culture issue, war issue that the Republicans cared about, and the Democrats too, it was abortions front and center. And I was surprised. Actually, was I that surprised? Because no, it's what the polling tells us. Most Americans are within a certain framework when it comes to abortion. They don't want abortions after, say, 20 weeks.
Right.
And that's 70% of America. And that's where our Republicans who describe themselves as pro-life, they wanted some, they still would maybe be okay with a rape exception, with an incest exception, with life of the mother. So it wasn't as absolute as what you hear from the most extreme ends of the party.
Right. But I mean, so that's a question, because they're in a place like Georgia, right? Herschel Walker has said no exceptions. I believe Doug Mastriano, the newly minted Republican nominee for governor in Pennsylvania, has said the same thing. In fact, you talk about ultra MAGA becoming mainstream. It seems that that belief amongst Republican candidates, anyway, seems to be dominating too, that there's zero exceptions no matter what. You see a lot of this stuff already passing. In your home state of Mississippi was the Supreme Court. It was the case that's gotten to the Supreme Court. We assume that the Alito leaked opinion will stand. In Missouri, in Louisiana, they're talking about that life begins at fertilization, which I'm not sure how you prove that. And if the Republican Party used to be the one of keep out of your bedroom, they're going to have somebody hanging around figuring out when that occurred. But to your point, I mean, I know that in, say, for example, in most European countries, I believe Poland is the only country still that has an outright ban. But in most European countries, I believe it's 15 weeks. And then I think there's a medical opinion. There's a psychological opinion. Obviously, I think, life of the mother, I think, is usually a pretty clear standard. But I think one thing I saw, at least, that's come up from this whole discussion is how much more nuance there is to an issue that's been really a black and white issue, batted back and forth by both Republicans and Democrats. And now it's like, okay, well, this is going to happen. What does it really mean?
And really with the Democrats that we spoke to also, who might have characterized themselves as very pro-choice, they were uncomfortable with saying that there could be abortion right up until the moment of labor. They had certain parameters that they wanted to have in place too. So it's not as black and white. And just because someone defines themselves within a camp, it doesn't mean that they are absolutists the way that the most extreme on the left and the most extreme on the right are. But then with Republicans, specifically the races in Georgia, I was surprised by, we played an ad of, well, it wasn't an ad, it was actually an interview that David Perdue did in Georgia. And he says that he would make abortion illegal, he would repeal immediately abortion in Georgia. And the GOP group, that gave them some pause, even the most pro-choice members of that group. And so it just shows you how there is a little bit more nuance, and those voters in the GOP group were rethinking Purdue after they saw that ad, even though we had some Purdue supporters in the Republican group, just so we could hear about the struggle between Brian Kemp and David Perdue as just a microcosm of the Donald Trump.
Let me ask you this, because it appears that, as I said, if even if polling was wrong in Georgia on this race, Brian Kemp is still going to win by 20. What were the feelings of the Republicans in particular on Purdue, decertifying 2020, the big steal, all that other stuff? Did they buy it, or was it sort of like, yeah, I know he's got to say it, but like it's over, like the guy won? What was the sense of it?
There were a few people in the group who thought it was a free and fair election, but the overwhelming majority of Republicans do think that there was some kind of election fraud. And they specifically cited the 2000 Mules movie by Dinesh D'Souza that I really had no idea what it was and wasn't familiar, but it had already really permeated this specific group in Georgia. But it shows you just the reach of a work like that, a movie based completely on election fraud and talking about vote harvesting, and that it's really seeped through in the conservative media ecosystem.
Well, and this is the other thing too. It's not just the media ecosystem, Elise, that I've been noticing is if you go back up to Pennsylvania for a second, in the U.S. Senate race there, that is ironically enough going to go down to a recount, is that the Kathy Barnett got 24% without basically running a campaign. That means that on 4chan, 8chan, Facebook, Telegram, whatever it is, there was movement on her behalf that none of us who don't spend a lot of time in those areas, excuse me, certainly not a Republican primary voter anymore, didn't see. And then when it started to pop up, as the true ultra MAGA candidate, right? Fox News and everybody else turned on her. And I think that's a fascinating thing. But I think also
a little bit of cold, so I'm going to have to keep hydrating as I do.
I understand.
Not COVID, but a cold.
But I mean, it's interesting to see that, like, this is one of those things, as Trygve has talked about, like, in these authoritarian movements, the only people they hate more than, the outsiders are each other.
Well, Kathy Barnett is maybe even more MAGA than Donald Trump. She is truly ultra MAGA. The phrase that, President Biden is trying to toss around as an insult, but the Republicans in our group thought it was just a badge of honor to be called ultra MAGA, to be, that category. They did not see it as a term of derision at all. And what Kathy Barnett did was pretty incredible, because these two rich guys out of state come in and are throwing so much money around, are going so negative, and she's on the sideline and really has a charismatic personality and a real presence. Say what you want of her, but she has a real presence. I might find her views repugnant, but she has kind of a politician talent that you kind of know it when you see it. And she managed to just clean up. And Dr. Oz would have had an outright victory if she hadn't just, taken so much of that vote.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing, just as a side note, Elise, on what you noted about, you can say someone has charisma, and that's not necessarily a positive. Donald Trump has a charisma.
He has charisma. He does. He has a certain it factor.
I think it's fundamentally damaging to the country. But, like, there is a reason why people go to see the show, right? There's a reason why that his followers are magnetized to him. And that's one thing I'd be interested, Elise, as you've seen this research, you've done this research for many years, is Trump is sort of the alpha, right? He's patient zero, whatever you want to call it. Do these other guys, and they're mostly guys, do you think Republican voters see them as sort of pretenders to the throne?
I think so. You see so many bad pretenders, Reed. I mean, Ted Cruz being, case study number one.
He's bad at everything, but yeah.
He's just the most, he has no authenticity whatsoever. Then Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, they're politicians that don't have charisma and aren't likable and aren't someone that, is a compelling character that you want to watch.
Right.
What's been interesting to me is I thought Ron DeSantis fell into that category too. And he started off, campaigning for governor, and he really did not seem to have much it factor at all. But he really, through the course of the pandemic and being on the front lines of Florida and open Florida for all, having a message that really resonated and then sparring with the media, he has kind of put himself in a unique place with the ultra MAGA voters that Donald Trump normally has such a firm hold on.
Well, and we hear, because we've got several of our team members in Florida, including Rick Wilson, who lives there in Tallahassee, that the only people that his campaign, whether or not it might be for governor or a nascent presidential run, the only people they care about and the people that they poll the most are the most base Republican primary voters. And if you see how he talks and acts, that makes sense. that he doesn't care about anybody else. He knows he can probably get across the line. But I mean, this is one thing. I was talking to a reporter just before we came on. I said, we have some friends down there, and the Don't Say Gay bill, all of the stuff on Disney, all of these things. The voters down there don't like it. But what happens is we're seeing is that he's doing a good job of drawing the Democrats into the culture war about Don't Say Gay, when Florida has the highest and fastest cost of living in the country. And rather than saying, why does he do these things? Because he doesn't want to talk about the things that he's failed at or that he can't fix for you, right?
He's not talking about improving healthcare in Florida.
I'm sorry?
He's not talking about improving healthcare in Florida. It's not like he has some tangible plan that he's touting. He would much rather talk about Disney and fight on his own turf, fight on comfortable turf, set the parameters of the discussion and make Disney flail and be, on the defensive, than to actually engage in real substance.
No, well, I mean, and that's the whole ballgame, right? I mean, look, politics has always been performance, right? Ronald Reagan, I think David Brinkley once asked, could you have done that? Did being an actor help you do this? And he said, I don't know that I could have done it without having been one, right? And so I think, unfortunately, we've taken that to a pretty illogical end. I want to switch gears on you for a second, Elise. So in this month's issue of The Atlantic, Tim Alberta, who is a terrific writer from Michigan originally, grew up in the evangelical church, and he went and interviewed many, many people in different veins of the evangelical church. Those who have sort of stayed strong to, we're a faith first kind of place, and then the other being the sort of the militant, almost militarized version, where everything is politics and religion are 100% mixed. And I think it's a noxious mix and a dangerous one because, religious wars in humanity, not exactly an unknown quantity. And my concern is that, you see a lot of these folks who get up there. It's the guy down in Tennessee, who's, they're going to hang Dr. Fauci, the woman in Georgia who's running a distant third, saying she's going to shoot any sheriff who doesn't abide by the law. The biblical law. Obviously, we have what was a strong separation of church and state, although we always expected our leaders to have some sort of faith. That's even true, I think, to this day. I mean, President Biden and Mrs. Biden are practicing Catholics. So what's your sense, having grown up, I believe, as a Southern Baptist, what's your sense of the church now? Not only in its religious context, but it's in a political context.
So for context now, I consider myself Episcopalian, and my mother passed away 3 years ago, and I would go to church with her regularly when I was at home, but I haven't been to the Southern Baptist Church, in a couple of years. But growing up, the big emphasis was on conversion. And basically, the preacher wanted to see some lost souls going down that aisle on Sunday and asking for forgiveness for their sins and giving their life to Jesus Christ. And metrics, the Baptists are concerned about numbers. They really wanted to, save a lot of souls. And part of the faith is just that you're supposed to be witnessing constantly, and you're supposed to be recruiting, essentially, and sharing the gospel, sharing the love, and bringing Jesus Christ into other people's lives. So Tim's story was interesting to me in the sense that wasn't the emphasis of the churches that he described in Michigan at all. And I don't think that it's just, a geographical divide. I think it's just how the church has shifted over, the last couple of decades. And certainly politics in the 90s was always a thing. But there never was any outright campaigning from church. And there were Democrats in the South and there were Republicans in the South, and everyone coexisted, pretty happily. And, it was what it was. The other question that I had about his article was, he was talking about attrition rates and people switching churches because of politics frequently. And that just happens a lot, no matter what. We called them church switchers back at home, people that would just always be unhappy with whatever the preacher was doing, so they bounced around from congregation to congregation. So I don't know if I make that much of the particulars of people leaving because of politics, but it's certainly the churches that he described. It just really sounds like politics has replaced the primary mission of what used to be a faith that was rooted in proselytizing and reaching people and telling them about the love of Jesus Christ. And politics is more important as a human ways to meet that game, to make that game. So it was really a fascinating, well written, well reported article. I'm a big Tim Alberta fan.
Well, there's a little bit of concern I have as someone who's an irregular churchgoer, to be honest, is that there are, I think, a lot of Americans in this country who are faithful, whatever their church might be, their synagogue, their mosque, wherever it might be, who a lot probably. A lot of Democratic candidates don't talk to. I don't believe the Democratic Party talks to people of faith other than probably the African American and Latino communities who still have, I think, a very rooted community and identity in their churches. And so I think that they're also just leaving a lot of votes on the table if we're going to make it a base issue. But I think also that there's, I think it is incumbent upon some, I'll call it rational, and rationality when it comes to faith I know is an oxymoron. Normal pastors of churches across this country, from east to west and north to south, to say, this is not what we represent. Because I think that, in one of the churches that Tim mentions in Tennessee, it went from 25 people to 100 people, now it's 3,000 people in a tent. And, they've got guys in body armor and camouflage and, armed, standing at the doors. What are you saying? Like, what are you saying to your parishioners when you have to walk through, a phalanx of very large armed men to sit down? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that Jesus was on the Mount, wielding an AR-15.
It's not a message of common love, but there's so many issues that come into this too. Just, the fact that armed men are standing at church, the fact that a crazed gunman goes into a black church in Carolina and kills, I think it was 12 people died, at that prayer meeting. It just is, it's heartbreaking that so much of our posture as Americans, as human beings, has to be about the defensive. How are we going to protect ourselves from one side might ascribe this as an evil and the other might be fighting against exactly the opposite, or fighting to preserve exactly the opposite.
So, I mean, and this is one I'd like to continue a conversation on, because I don't think that we think about it enough. So I want to, last thing in the few minutes we have left. So Elise, you grew up in Mississippi, and you went to Yale, Ivy League, right? Got a great education, and you have obviously made the most of it through will and talent, as many people do. We launched an ad that we'll show in a few minutes here about Elise Stefanik. Elise, not that different a path, right? Grew up in small town New York, went to Harvard, but was someone who worked for George W. Bush, right? Did debate prep for Paul Ryan, was, I think, the youngest female ever elected to Congress, was, as that sort of generation next, or whatever they used to call themselves, the Mav Pack people of the Bush, the kids of big Bush donors, right? She was going to be the future of the Republican Party. It turns out they're right. They just didn't know why. What's your sense of that? Because to me, the cynicism isn't unbelievable, but it is striking that folks like her have to double and triple down on the ultra MAGA crazy to prove their bona fides. I mean, as you sit there watching her, what's your sense of it?
Power is extraordinary. The depths that people will go to in order to grasp at it again and again and again, and to keep it within their reach. We've seen this in so many cases, and I'm just cynical, but it's all about pure power and nothing else. And I just don't get what the point is of having that power if you aren't doing something that you actually believe in and that you're proud of when you go home at the end of every day. And if you're that malleable, then maybe you've never really believed in anything to begin with. Right.
I mean, what do you think she tells herself when she looks in the mirror?
I am climbing the ladder. I am an organization kid, and that was the name that David Brooks coined for Ivy Leaguers he followed at Princeton back when I was in college, who were just doing everything they could to climb the ladder. And they worked themselves to death. They didn't do things for enjoyment or because of passion, but they wanted to climb the ladder and just keep doing the things within the hierarchy that would lead to eventual success. And I think that she sees this as critical to her eventual political success, to keep climbing the ladder.
Do you think that there was a time in her life that she thought, I'm gonna run, race replacement theory ads in my district to scare mostly white people in my district? Is there? I know you haven't made this transformation, so I guess I'm just asking you to think about it. Like, is it like you start down the slippery slope and then the ends justify the means?
Well, it's the self-justification that you have for every step along the way. There were points I was working on, Iraq war comms, and I just started to not really believe, I was in Baghdad and I saw how bad the violence was, yet I was trying to arrange press trips for media so we could get some, good stories about what we were doing out. And I didn't have a good feeling about myself. And, I never want to feel like that ever again, where I look back on something I supported and I knew at the time that I should be questioning, but I was so invested in it and I had so many people around who were invested in it and were self-reinforcing the bad idea. And so I think once you have gone down that path, it's just so hard to let go, admit how wrong you are when you can demonize the other side and just keep blaming it on them.
And of course, we see with both Stefanik and so many of these others that there has been no sanction and no consequence so far.
Exactly. She's benefited.
Right. She's benefited from
sure.
it.
Yeah.
And so she's got Kevin McCarthy firmly in her sights. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, she'll do whatever it takes, I think, to make sure that whether or not it's Trump or whoever these people are, know that she's, loyal. She'll do whatever. Kevin, Kevin's the rush chairman. He's just trying to get through the weekend. So, all right. Listen, Elise.
If you're willing to do the replacement, then you'll do anything. Because What is your soul? If you're in American politics and you're willing to play footsie with replacement theory, then you're willing to do absolutely anything. And you know better. You have an education. You know about the history of slavery in this country. You know about the legacy of civil rights and Jim Crow. And to be talking this way and to not be helping heal the divide, that's just sick.
Well, listen, she's not playing footsie. She's doing the lambada with it. So,
yeah, right.
All right. Well, listen, Elise, I want to thank you. Before we get out of here, folks, I got a couple of programming notes for you. First, tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern, the game we're in with the aforementioned Trygve Olsen and Maya May, talking about what it is we're looking at, what the fight is that we face, and how we have to fight the bad guys. Also, Wednesday night, 8 Eastern, Trygve and Maya and I will join them. A Road to the Midterms Town Hall virtual event. I hope you'll join us. Sign up now, wherever you can. Also want to make sure that you remember that Tuesday and Thursday nights we have the breakdown with Tara Setmeyer and Rick Wilson. Wednesdays, we're speaking with Maya May and Lisa Senecal. Always, please remember to tune in to the Lincoln Project podcast. I just had Elise on. Hope you'll give it a listen and rate 5 stars. With that, Felicia, why don't we go ahead and run our spot that is making Miss Stefanik so crazy this morning, and then we'll let everybody get back to their day.
What's the word to describe Elise Stefanik? Climber, ruthless, a Harvard-educated schemer who never met a back she wouldn't stab. To replace Kevin McCarthy as House Speaker, Elise has a plan. Become the leader of the ultra-MAGA GOP. QAnon, pedophiles, conspiracies, hate. And it's working for her. Companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Home Depot, and the Altria Group still flood Elise Stefanik with thousands of dollars. What does Stefanik do with corporate donations like these? She runs ads promoting the racist white replacement theory.
This has been an invasion.
Buffalo paid in blood for the white replacement theory she promotes for power. Elise doesn't care. and won't stop selling racial hatred, there is a word for Elise Stefanik: evil.
The Lincoln Project paid for and is responsible for the content of this advertising.